Claire sat alone on the small balcony of her cramped studio apartment, looking out over the dimly lit streets of Seattle. She clutched a cup of coffee in her hand, lukewarm now, abandoned during one of her many brooding silences. It had been 2 years since Ryan's death, but the pain still lingered, a dull ache that never fully dissipated. Claire had once been a prominent journalist, known for her fearless reporting and unyielding pursuit of truth. But love had changed everything. She remembered the exact moment she chose to walk away from her career. Ryan had looked into her eyes, his gaze full of promises. "We'll make it work," he had said, his voice firm yet tender. Trusting him, she had let go of her ambition, trading deadlines for domesticity. It was a decision she never thought she'd regret, until the accident. Ryan's sudden death had shattered not only her heart, but also her sense of stability. He had been her anchor, the one constant in a world that was now foreign and hostile. She quickly found herself spiraling down a financial abyss. The savings that Ryan had left behind weren't enough to sustain her lifestyle. The bills piled up, and the threat of eviction became a looming reality. Desperate for work, she took a job as a housekeeper on a cruise ship, cleaning rooms and wiping tables, a far cry from the life she had envisioned. The cruise was her escape from the city that held too many memories. It was a temporary solution, a way to keep herself afloat, but every day felt like a compromise, each hour a reminder of what she had lost. The passengers were mostly wealthy, detached from her world of surviving paycheck to paycheck. Yet, their lives intrigued her. She found herself observing them, analyzing their stories in her mind. Old habits of journalism died hard. At night, when the ship was quiet and the ocean stretched endlessly beneath a starless sky, Claire allowed herself to mourn. It was safer that way. No witnesses, no questions. She often revisited the day of Ryan's death in her mind, replaying the details like a detective examining a cold case. The call from the hospital, the sterile smell of the morgue, the sight of his lifeless body, it all felt unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's tragedy. Yet, the emptiness beside her every morning was all too real. Despite the grief, something else gnawed at her, a sense of unfinished business. Ryan's death had been labeled an accident, but a lingering doubt remained in her mind. Claire's instincts, the ones that once led her to uncover hidden truths, whispered that there was more to the story. But with Ryan gone, she felt powerless to pursue answers. She had grown distrustful, even of those who tried to help her. Kind gestures seemed tainted, as if they carried ulterior motives. Ryan had taught her to be open, to let people in. Now, she had built walls around her heart, higher than ever before. As she stood up to leave the balcony, a seagull landed on the railing, staring at her with piercing eyes. For a fleeting moment, she saw a reflection of her own defiance in its gaze, a reminder that despite everything, she was still here, still surviving. And then, somewhere deep within her, a small flame of determination flickered. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely ready to let the past rest. Claire's routine on the cruise was as monotonous as the gentle sway of the ship. Each morning, she would rise before dawn, her body moving mechanically as she prepared for another day of cleaning. She would push the cart down the narrow hallways, her eyes focused on the path ahead, avoiding eye contact with passengers. Her role was to be invisible, and she had mastered it. But on the 4th day of the trip, something disrupted her carefully maintained detachment. It happened during lunch service. Claire was stationed near the entrance of the grand dining hall, making sure the buffet counters stayed clean. The room was filled with the chatter of passengers and the clinking of silverware against porcelain. She was wiping down a table when she felt a sudden chill, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She looked up, her gaze scanning the crowd, and then she saw him. A man, standing by the windows, his silhouette bathed in the soft afternoon light. He was looking out to sea, unaware of her stare. But Claire's heart was already racing, her grip on the cleaning cloth tightening until her knuckles turned white. The man's build, the slope of his shoulders, even the way he stood. It was all so familiar. Her mind screamed a name she hadn't dared to say aloud in months. Ryan? She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear away the illusion. But when she looked again, he was still there. leaning casually against the window frame. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled backward, bumping into another staff member. "Are you okay?" a colleague asked, concern etched on his face. Claire barely registered the question, her focus still on the man. "Yeah, I'm fine," she managed to mutter, her voice shaky. She forced herself to look away, pretending to fix a misplaced fork on a nearby table. Her mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. It couldn't be him. Ryan was dead, she reminded herself firmly. She had identified his body, attended the funeral, seen the closed casket lowered into the ground. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable. For the rest of the afternoon, Claire's concentration wavered. Her thoughts were consumed by the man who looked so much like Ryan. The urge to follow him, to confront him, was almost unbearable. But fear held her back. What if she was just seeing things, her mind playing tricks on her? She had read about this kind of phenomenon, grief-induced hallucinations, mirages created by longing. She decided to wait. She needed another glimpse, something to confirm that her mind wasn't betraying her. Later that evening, as the ship hosted a formal dinner for the guests, Claire stationed herself at the back of the ballroom, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was looking for him, for the face that had haunted her thoughts all day. And then she saw him again. He was standing at the bar, talking to a group of passengers, a glass of whiskey in his hand. This time, Claire noticed more details. The way he laughed, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke. It was Ryan's laughter, Ryan's gestures. Her chest tightened, a mix of hope and dread. She wanted to run to him, to grab his arm and demand answers. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her mind paralyzed by doubt. "Do you know him?" a waiter asked as he walked by, noticing her fixed stare. "No," she lied, her voice barely audible. "I thought I did, but it's no one." Claire's sleep that night was restless, plagued by dreams of Ryan. In one dream, he was reaching out to her, calling her name. But when she tried to run towards him, her legs felt heavy, as if trapped in quicksand. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart aching with an intensity she hadn't felt in months. The following morning, Claire made a decision. She needed to know who this man was. She had to be sure, no matter how painful the truth might be. She asked around discreetly among the staff, trying to gather information about the mysterious passenger. Her inquiries were met with vague answers. He was just another guest, apparently traveling alone. Feeling a surge of desperation, Claire finally approached the reception desk. She had rehearsed her question, trying to make it sound casual. "I noticed one of the passengers looks familiar," she said, her voice steady. "Do you happen to know his name?" The receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile, glanced at Claire curiously. "We're not supposed to give out personal information, but I can at least tell you his name. He's registered as Lucas Turner." "Lucas Turner?" Claire repeated to herself. It was a name she didn't recognize, but the sense of familiarity remained. Her mind buzzed with questions. Could it be an alias? Could Ryan have faked his death somehow? The rational part of her rejected the idea as absurd, but her heart, desperate for closure, clung to the possibility. Claire's obsession with Lucas Turner deepened over the next few days. She found herself watching him from a distance, noting his routine, studying his mannerisms. He spent his mornings at the gym, afternoons by the pool, and evenings at the bar. She tried to convince herself that it was just curiosity, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. On the fifth night, she gathered the courage to approach him directly. It was after dinner, and Lucas was seated alone at one of the quieter corners of the deck, a book in his hands. Claire's legs felt like lead as she walked towards him, her heart pounding louder with each step. When she was just a few feet away, Lucas looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Claire felt the world tilt around her. The eyes, those familiar, piercing blue eyes. Her breath caught in her throat, and she struggled to find her voice. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You look a lot like someone I knew." Lucas raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. "Is that so?" "I've been told I have one of those faces," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. Claire felt a mixture of relief and frustration. His voice was different, but the resemblance was too strong to ignore. "What brings you on this cruise?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on hers. "Just needed a break, I suppose. Life can get overwhelming sometimes." The words hit Claire like a punch. It was something Ryan had once said to her, almost verbatim. A surge of anger mixed with confusion welled up inside her. She wanted to shout, to demand the truth. But instead, she nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, I get that," she said, before turning away, her mind a storm of emotions. As she walked back to her cabin, one question echoed in her mind. Was it possible? Could Ryan really be alive? Claire's mind was a battlefield. The more she observed Lucas, the more she was convinced that there was something off about him. Everything about him. His smile, his mannerisms, even the way he held a glass, mirrored Ryan's gestures perfectly. It couldn't just be a coincidence. Claire's instincts, sharpened by years of investigative journalism, were on high alert. She knew she had to get closer, to learn more about Lucas Turner. The next morning, Claire decided to change her approach. She would no longer watch from a distance. Instead, she needed to engage him, test him, push his boundaries. But she also had to be cautious. She couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment, no matter how desperately she wanted answers. She found her opportunity at a cocktail party on the ship's upper deck. The event was filled with elegant passengers dressed in their finest, but Claire's eyes were locked on Lucas, who stood near the bar, chatting with a couple of guests. Claire took a deep breath, adjusted her dress, and made her way over. "Lucas Turner, right?" she asked with a friendly smile, pretending to be just another curious passenger. "We've run into each other a few times." "I'm Claire." Lucas turned to her, his expression warm but guarded. "Yes, I remember you," he said, extending his hand. "Nice to officially meet you, Claire." As they shook hands, Claire felt a strange mix of familiarity and unease. His grip was firm, just like Ryan's. She fought to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't help but notice you seem quite familiar. Have you been on this cruise before?" Lucas chuckled lightly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No, first time," he replied. "But I do travel a lot. Maybe we've crossed paths somewhere else." His response was vague, and Claire seized the opening. "Oh, really? What do you do that keeps you traveling so much?" Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I'm involved in philanthropy. I work with refugees and displaced communities, mainly in conflict zones. It's exhausting but rewarding." Claire felt a twinge of disbelief. The story sounded polished, too perfect, but there was also a ring of truth to it. Ryan had always talked about wanting to help others, to make a difference. The resemblance was uncanny, and it only deepened her suspicions. "That's impressive," Claire said, feigning admiration. "My late husband used to work in a similar field. He was passionate about humanitarian causes." She watched Lucas's reaction closely, hoping for a flicker of recognition. For a moment, his expression shifted, his eyes darkening slightly. But just as quickly, he composed himself, offering a polite nod. "I'm sorry to hear about your husband," he said sincerely. "It's always hard to lose someone you love." Claire's heart ached at his words. The sympathy felt genuine, but it also felt like something Ryan would say. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to keep going. "It was an accident," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. Very sudden. Lucas's gaze lingered on her, a softness in his eyes that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. "Life can be cruel," he said quietly, "but we have to keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurts." The words struck Claire deeply. It was as if he was speaking directly to her pain, as if he understood exactly what she had been through. The rational part of her screamed that it was all an act, but another part, the part still in love with Ryan, wanted to believe him. Over the following days, Claire found herself drawn to Lucas more and more. She tried to ask him about his past, probing with questions that were designed to catch him off guard. "Have you always lived in the States?" she asked one afternoon, as they sat at a quiet corner of the deck. Lucas seemed unfazed. "I was born here, but I've spent most of my adult life abroad," he answered smoothly. "Work has taken me all over." Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. It must be hard, always being on the move. No time for a stable life, Lucas's expression was thoughtful. It can be lonely, but I've learned to adapt, he said. Sometimes, you have to let go of the things that tie you down. It was a cryptic statement, but it was enough to make Claire's heart race. It felt like a veiled confession, an acknowledgement of the life he had left behind, of her. She wanted to press him further, to ask the questions that burned inside her. But she held back, afraid of pushing too hard, too soon. One evening, as the ship sailed under a crescent moon, Claire found Lucas sitting alone at the rear deck, staring out at the sea. The scene was eerily familiar, reminiscent of the nights she and Ryan used to spend together. She hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Lucas glanced at her, a faint smile appearing. "Not at all," he replied, motioning to the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of waves filling the space between them. Claire could feel her resolve weakening, her need for answers becoming unbearable. "You remind me so much of him," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Lucas turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Of who?" "Ryan," she whispered, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "My husband. You're so much like him." Lucas's face was unreadable, but there was a flash of something, pain, perhaps, that flickered in his eyes. "I'm not him, Claire," he said gently. "I'm Lucas." Claire felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "It's not just how you look," she insisted. "It's how you talk, the things you say, even the way you laugh." Lucas took a deep breath, as if struggling to find the right words. "Sometimes, people carry echoes of others," he said slowly. "But that doesn't mean they're the same person." The ambiguity of his words infuriated Claire. She felt a surge of frustration and anger. "You don't understand," she said sharply. "I loved him. He was everything to me. And then, he was gone, just like that." Lucas's gaze softened. His eyes filled with an emotion Claire couldn't quite decipher. "I do understand," he said quietly. "More than you know." Claire's chest tightened, a mix of hope and fear consuming her. "Are you hiding something from me?" she asked suddenly, unable to contain herself any longer. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Lucas looked away, his jaw clenched. "There are things I can't talk about," he said, his voice low. "But it's not what you think." Claire's frustration boiled over. "Then what is it, Lucas? Who are you? Really?" He turned to face her, his expression haunted. "I'm someone who's made mistakes," he said. "Mistakes that can't be undone." The cryptic confession only deepened the mystery, but it also gave Claire a strange sense of validation. There was something more beneath the surface, something he wasn't telling her. And Claire knew she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. The days following their conversation were a haze of mixed emotions for Claire. Lucas had become more than just a lookalike. He was now the focal point of her obsession. Despite his evasive answers and cryptic remarks, she was certain that Lucas Turner was hiding something, possibly even hiding who he really was. Determined to peel away the layers of deception, Claire decided to confront him more directly. She needed to find out if Lucas truly held the answers she sought, even if it meant risking her own sanity. Late one afternoon, as the ship approached the shores of Santorini, the passengers were buzzing with excitement about their upcoming excursion. But Claire had no interest in the picturesque islands or the sunlit beaches. Her focus was solely on Lucas, who had, as expected, decided to stay on board. She knew she had to act now, while the ship was quieter and Lucas was less guarded. Claire found him in the ship's library, alone in a corner, flipping through a book he seemed barely interested in. He looked up when she approached, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Claire," he greeted, closing the book. "I thought you'd be out exploring like everyone else." She forced a casual smile, hiding the intensity beneath. "I prefer the quiet," she said, taking the seat across from him. "Besides, there's something I need to discuss with you." Lucas leaned back, a guarded expression settling on his face. "I'm listening." Claire hesitated for a moment, then pressed forward. "I want you to stop pretending, Lucas. Stop playing games." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I don't believe for a second that you're just some philanthropist traveling for leisure," she continued, her voice steady but edged with emotion. "The way you speak, the things you say, it's all too familiar. You're not telling me the whole truth." Lucas's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with something unreadable. "And what truth do you think you know, Claire?" The challenge in his voice only fueled Claire's resolve. "I think you're Ryan," she said bluntly, her eyes locked onto his. "Or at least you were." For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Ryan's dead," Lucas replied, his voice low but firm. "You saw the body, didn't you?" The question sent a cold shiver down Claire's spine. He knew too much. "Yes," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But that doesn't mean you're not him. People can fake deaths, create new identities. I was a journalist, Lucas. I know how these things work." Lucas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And why would someone go to such lengths? To fake their own death, leave everything behind, including the person they love?" Claire's heart pounded at his words, each one laced with a strange blend of anger and longing. "Maybe it was to protect someone," she said, almost defiantly. "Or maybe there was something bigger, something dangerous that made it necessary." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint creaking of the ship. Lucas finally looked away, his expression torn. "You want me to be him," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. "You need me to be him." Claire felt a surge of frustration, her voice rising. "It's not about what I want. It's about the truth. If you really are Ryan, you owe me that much." Lucas's face remained unreadable, but his voice was filled with an unfamiliar tenderness. "Sometimes, the truth isn't as clear-cut as we want it to be, Claire. Sometimes, it's wrapped in lies we never intended to tell." Claire's eyes filled with tears, a mix of anger and despair. "Why won't you just say it? Why won't you admit who you really are?" Lucas looked at her, his expression one of deep sadness. "Because admitting it could put you in danger," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And that's the last thing I want." The words hit Claire like a punch, leaving her breathless. It wasn't the confession she was hoping for, but it was enough to keep her pursuing the truth. "Then help me understand," she pleaded, her voice raw. "If there's danger, I deserve to know what it is." Lucas remained silent, his eyes fixed on hers, a storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. Finally, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This conversation is over," he said, his tone harsh. "You need to let this go, Claire. It's for your own good." But Claire wasn't willing to back down. She grabbed his arm as he tried to leave, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, it's not over," she insisted. "You can't just walk away and expect me to forget everything. Not after what we had." Lucas paused, his body rigid under her touch. For a moment, she thought he might open up, that he might finally break. But then he gently removed her hand from his arm, his eyes filled with a painful kind of determination. "I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly, "and the sooner you accept that, the safer you'll be." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there, her heart shattered once again. But this time, the pain was mixed with something new, an undeniable sense that there was more to uncover, that Lucas's words were not just warnings but pieces of a larger puzzle. As night fell, Claire retreated to her cabin, her mind replaying every moment of their encounter. She knew now that she was close to something, even if Lucas refused to admit it. The next step, she realized, was to find proof, something concrete that could link Lucas to Ryan. Driven by a mixture of desperation and relentless curiosity, Claire began her investigation that very night. She managed to gain access to the ship's passenger registry, scanning through the details of Lucas Turner's booking. To her surprise, the information was surprisingly sparse, just a name, an address in New York, and a contact number that led nowhere. The lack of details only heightened her suspicions. She decided to search his cabin, hoping to find something, anything, that might reveal the truth. It was risky, she knew, but the stakes were too high to turn back now. Claire waited until she was sure Lucas had left his cabin for the evening. With a makeshift lockpick, a skill she had picked up during her reporting days, she managed to open the door. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, the darkness of the room adding to the tension. The cabin was neat, almost sterile, with no personal items in sight. Claire moved quickly, checking drawers, suitcases, and even the bathroom cabinets. But it was as if Lucas had erased any trace of himself. Just as she was about to leave, defeated, she noticed a small leather-bound journal tucked under the mattress. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found notes, names, and places, all written in a hurried script that felt familiar. But what caught her attention was a single word, scribbled repeatedly on one page. Ryan. Claire's heart raced as she realized the implications. The journal was the link she had been searching for, the missing piece that tied Lucas to Ryan's past. She closed the journal quickly, her mind spinning with questions. What was the real story? Why was Lucas, or Ryan, here, and what kind of danger was he so afraid of? As she slipped back into her own cabin, the weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her. The truth was closer than ever, but it was also more terrifying than she had imagined. Claire spent the next morning hidden in her cabin, the small journal spread out before her on the bed. Each entry revealed pieces of a life that Lucas, if he was indeed Ryan, had been living in secret. Most pages contained cryptic notes about meetings, coded locations, and references to people she didn't recognize. But what stood out were the fragments that seemed directed at her, scattered across the pages like whispers in the dark. Protect Claire, keep her away, and she can't know. Her mind reeled with questions. Why would Ryan go to such lengths to hide? And who or what was he protecting her from? The words filled her with equal parts dread and a strange sense of vindication. The man she loved was alive, but the circumstances of his return were darker than anything she had imagined. As the hours passed, a plan began to form in Claire's mind. If she wanted the truth, she would have to confront Lucas again, but this time armed with the knowledge she had gained. She needed to push him harder, force him to reveal the real reason he had faked his death. That evening, she waited for him on the ship's top deck, a place that had become a quiet retreat for passengers seeking solitude. The stars were bright above, the sea a dark, endless void below. Lucas appeared, as she had hoped, moving towards the railing with a weary expression. He seemed lost in thought, his shoulders heavy with an invisible burden. Claire stepped out of the shadows, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We need to talk." Lucas turned to face her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Claire," he said slowly. "This again? No more evasions." She cut him off, her tone firm. "I found your journal, Lucas. Or should I call you Ryan?" For the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. He took a step closer, his voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't have done that, Claire. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Claire refused to back down. "Then explain it to me," she demanded. "Who are you really? And why did you disappear?" Lucas's gaze was intense, a mixture of anger and desperation. "I faked my death to protect you," he admitted finally, his voice raw. "There were people after me, dangerous people. If they knew you were alive and connected to me, you would have been their next target." Claire's heart pounded at the words. "So it was all for my safety?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "And you thought disappearing without a word was the best way to protect me?" Lucas's face was etched with pain. "It was the only way," he insisted. "I made enemies within the company I worked for. I uncovered something that put both of us at risk." Claire's mind raced back to the stories Ryan had told her about his work, the secretive deals and the potential for danger. "What did you uncover?" she pressed. Lucas hesitated, then looked away, as if the truth was too much to bear. "It was corporate espionage," he confessed. "But it went deeper than that. Organized crime, human trafficking, money laundering. I stumbled upon things I shouldn't have seen." The revelation hit Claire like a punch. She had always known Ryan's work was risky, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I could have helped. I couldn't put you in that kind of danger," Lucas said, his voice filled with regret. "I had to disappear before they came after you. And even now, they're still out there, watching." Claire's mind swirled with the implications. The threat was still real, still looming over them both. "So what's your plan now?" she asked. "Keep pretending you're someone else forever?" Lucas's expression darkened. "I don't have a choice, Claire. If they find out I'm alive, it's not just my life on the line. It's yours too." For a moment, Claire felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "You should have trusted me," she said, her voice harsh. "You took away my choice, my right to decide for myself." Lucas's eyes were filled with pain. "I know," he admitted, "and I'm sorry, but I did it to save you." The sincerity in his voice broke through Claire's anger, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I never stopped loving you. You know that? Even after everything, I never stopped." Lucas's expression softened, a deep sadness in his eyes. "I never stopped loving you either," he said quietly, "but I can't let you be part of this. It's too dangerous." Claire's resolve hardened. "It's too late for that," she said. "I'm already involved, whether you like it or not. And I won't let you face this alone." Lucas looked at her with a mix of admiration and fear. "You're as stubborn as ever," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You taught me that." Claire shot back, her eyes locked on his. Before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps interrupted the moment. Claire instinctively stepped back, and Lucas's expression shifted from tenderness to alarm. A group of men approached from the shadows, their faces partially obscured by the dim lighting. Claire's heart raced as she realized they weren't just passengers. They had the hard, focused look of professionals. "Lucas Turner," one of them called out, his voice cold and authoritative. "We need to have a word." Lucas's body tensed, his eyes narrowing. "Claire, get out of here," he hissed urgently. "Now." But Claire refused to move. "Not without you," she said defiantly. The men stepped closer, forming a semicircle around them. "This doesn't concern the lady," the leader said, his tone menacing. "We're only here for you." Claire's mind raced, but Lucas's voice cut through her panic. "Do as they say, Claire. Please." It was the pleading note in his voice that broke her. Reluctantly, she took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll find you," she vowed. "No matter what." Lucas's eyes were filled with a strange mix of fear and hope. "I know you will," he said softly. With that, the men moved in, grabbing Lucas roughly by the arms. Claire felt a surge of panic as they led him away, disappearing into the darkness of the ship's lower decks. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Lucas had been right all along. There were people hunting him, and now she was caught in the middle of it all. But Claire's fear quickly turned to resolve. She wasn't about to let the man she loved be taken away again, not without a fight. As the ship's lights flickered overhead, Claire made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth, no matter how deep or dangerous it was. She would save Lucas, just as he had once tried to save her. The ship felt emptier without Lucas. The air was thick with uncertainty, and Claire felt the weight of isolation bearing down on her. She spent hours pacing the cramped space of her cabin, her mind racing with possible scenarios of what might be happening to him. Where had they taken him? What were they planning to do? The questions gnawed at her relentlessly. Claire knew she couldn't afford to be passive. She had to act, to find out who those men were and why they had come for Lucas. Gathering what little courage she had left, she ventured out, determined to retrace Lucas's last steps. She walked the length of the ship, studying every shadowed corner and speaking discreetly with staff members. She was careful not to arouse suspicion, masking her desperation behind a facade of calm. In the ship's security office, she overheard two guards talking about an incident from the previous night. She managed to slip inside, her nerves taut as she navigated the maze of surveillance screens. To her shock, she found a screen replaying footage from the deck where Lucas had been taken. She watched as the men escorted him into a restricted area below deck. It wasn't a part of the ship accessible to passengers. It seemed more like a hidden world beneath the surface. She quickly jotted down details, timestamps, the route they took, and anything that might help her find Lucas. But she knew this wasn't enough. She needed more information, someone who could provide real answers. Claire's instincts as a journalist kicked in. It was time to push her limits, to take risks she hadn't considered before. Later that afternoon, she spotted one of the men who had been with Lucas. He was at the ship's bar, nursing a drink, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the room. Claire felt a surge of adrenaline. She needed to approach him, no matter the risk. Summoning her courage, she slid onto the bar stool next to him, her voice casual but tinged with urgency. "Rough night?" she asked. The man turned to her, his eyes cold and assessing. "What's it to you?" Claire forced a small smile. "Just curious. I saw you on the deck last night. Looked like there was some trouble." The man's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of wariness in his gaze. "You should mind your own business," he said gruffly. Claire leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I can't do that. Not when someone I care about is involved." The man's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. "What's your connection to Lucas Turner?" "More than you think," Claire replied, her voice steady. "And I want to know where he is." The man chuckled, a humorless sound. "That's not something you want to get mixed up in, lady." "Too late for that," she shot back. "I've been mixed up in it from the start." There was a tense silence as the man seemed to consider her words. Finally, he sighed, taking a sip of his drink. "If you're smart, you'll walk away. This isn't your fight." Claire's eyes flashed with determination. "It became my fight the moment you took him." The man shook his head, almost as if he pitied her. "Lucas isn't who you think he is," he said quietly. "He's made enemies, powerful ones. You don't know the half of it." "Then tell me," Claire insisted. "Help me understand." The man glanced around, ensuring no one was listening, before leaning closer to Claire. "He's not just running from enemies. He's been playing both sides, using people to get what he needs. Some say he's a hero, others say he's a traitor. It depends on who you ask." Claire's heart raced at the revelation. Could Lucas really be both savior and deceiver? "But what about me?" she pressed. "Was he just using me too?" The man seemed to hesitate, as if he wasn't sure whether to answer. "I don't know about that," he finally said. "But I do know he's trying to protect you, whether you want it or not." Claire felt a mix of anger and confusion. "Where is he now?" she asked. The man sighed, as if resigned to the inevitable. "They've taken him to the lower levels, where they keep the high-risk detainees." "He's not going anywhere soon." Claire's stomach twisted at the words. "Why are they holding him? What do they want?" "Answers," the man said simply. "Lucas has information they want, and they're not leaving until they get it." Claire's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear. She had to find a way to reach Lucas before it was too late. The man's warnings lingered, but Claire was beyond fear now. She was driven by a single purpose: to get Lucas back, no matter what it took. The following night, Claire prepared for her most dangerous move yet. She had studied the ship's layout, memorized the route to the restricted area, and pieced together a plan. Disguised as a crew member, she made her way to the lower decks, her heart pounding with each step. The corridors were dimly lit and eerily quiet, the air filled with a musty, metallic scent. She reached the entrance to the restricted area, a heavy steel door guarded by a single man. Claire approached him, her movements confident. "Captain's orders," she said, showing a forged ID she had managed to create. The guard eyed her suspiciously, but seemed to buy the ruse. He unlocked the door, allowing her to slip inside. Claire felt a surge of relief, but knew this was just the beginning. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. She followed the sound of distant voices, moving cautiously through the maze-like hallways. Her instincts told her she was getting closer, and soon, she heard a familiar voice, Lucas's voice. She rounded a corner and found him in a small, windowless room, his hands cuffed to a metal chair. His face was bruised, his eyes hollow but still burning with defiance. He looked up as she entered, shock and disbelief flashing across his face. "Claire," he whispered, his voice raw. "What are you doing here?" Claire rushed to his side, her eyes filled with urgency. "I came to get you out," she said, her voice fierce. "I couldn't leave you behind." Lucas's eyes were a mix of anger and relief. "You shouldn't have come," he said hoarsely. "It's too dangerous." "I don't care," Claire replied, her voice breaking. "I'm not losing you again." Before Lucas could respond, the door behind them burst open, and two men stormed in, guns drawn. Claire froze, her mind racing for a way out. But Lucas moved quickly. Despite the cuffs, he managed to kick one of the guards, knocking him off balance. The other man swung his gun towards Claire, but she ducked, her survival instincts taking over. She grabbed a nearby chair, swinging it at the guard's legs, causing him to stumble. It was chaos, a blur of movement and adrenaline. Somehow, they managed to overpower the guards. Lucas, still cuffed, looked at Claire with a mix of awe and fear. "You're insane," he muttered, but there was a hint of a smile in his voice. Claire found the key to the cuffs on one of the unconscious guards, quickly freeing Lucas. "We need to move," she said urgently. They ran through the corridors, the sound of alarms blaring behind them. The ship's lower decks felt like a labyrinth, but Claire's determination was unbreakable. She knew she had to keep going, to get Lucas to safety. As they reached a narrow staircase leading back to the main deck, Lucas paused, grabbing Claire's arm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "They won't stop coming after us. You need to leave, find a way off this ship." Claire's eyes blazed with defiance. "Not without you," she insisted. Lucas's gaze softened, filled with a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I never wanted this for you," he said. "But you've always been stronger than me, Claire. I see that now." Claire felt a lump in her throat, but there was no time for sentiment. "Then let's finish this, together," she said, her voice firm. They burst onto the main deck, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. But Claire felt a surge of hope. Freedom was within reach, and so was the truth. Claire and Lucas ran through the upper deck, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The ship's alarms continued to blare, a blinding mix of noise and flashing lights that only fueled Claire's adrenaline. The cold night air stung her skin as they reached an open deck, the vast sea stretching into darkness around them. Lucas was still struggling to regain full control of his movements after being bound for so long. He stumbled slightly, and Claire instinctively reached out, steadying him. His touch was warm despite the cold, and for a brief moment, they locked eyes, an unspoken promise passing between them. "Where do we go from here?" Claire asked breathlessly, glancing around for signs of pursuit. Lucas scanned the deck quickly, his expression calculating. "There's a lifeboat launch area ahead," he said, pointing towards a metal staircase leading down to the lower platform. "We need to get off this ship. It's the only way." Claire felt a surge of fear mixed with determination. "And then what?" she pressed. "We disappear," Lucas replied, his voice firm but strained. "We'll find somewhere to regroup, figure out our next move." As they reached the lifeboat area, Lucas quickly assessed the small emergency vessel. "It's manual launch," he muttered. "I can get it down, but it'll be noisy." Claire nodded. "Do it." Lucas worked fast, releasing the safety mechanisms and pulling the heavy lever. The winch squealed loudly as the small lifeboat lowered into the water below. The noise was deafening, and Claire's heart raced, knowing it was only a matter of time before their pursuers arrived. "Go," Lucas urged, motioning towards the rope ladder leading down to the boat. Claire climbed down quickly, feeling the rough rope burn against her hands. She landed inside the swaying lifeboat, watching as Lucas followed. Just as he reached the bottom of the ladder, a shot rang out, piercing the night air. Claire's heart leapt in terror, and she instinctively ducked, her eyes scanning for the source of the gunfire. She saw them, 3 men rushing onto the deck, guns drawn. "Lucas, hurry!" she screamed, reaching out to help him into the boat. Lucas dropped down beside her, his breathing heavy. "Hold on!" he shouted as he unhooked the lifeboat from the ship's harness. The small vessel hit the water with a jolt, sending waves splashing over the sides. They began rowing furiously, putting as much distance between themselves and the ship as possible. The men on the deck continued firing, but the bullets splashed harmlessly into the water, missing their target. As the lifeboat drifted farther into the darkness, Claire allowed herself a moment of relief. But it was short-lived. "Where are we headed?" she asked, her voice shaky. "There's a small island nearby," Lucas answered, his voice low but steady. "It's deserted, but it'll give us cover until we figure out our next steps." Claire nodded. exhaustion settling into her bones. She could see the faint outline of land in the distance, a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. As they rode in silence, Claire's thoughts raced. Everything Lucas had revealed, everything she had experienced over the past few days, felt surreal, like a twisted version of the life she had once known. She turned to Lucas, unable to contain her frustration any longer. "You should have told me," she said, her voice breaking. "You should have trusted me from the start." Lucas's face was shadowed in the dim moonlight, but she could see the regret etched in his eyes. "I know," he admitted, "but I didn't want you to live like this. Always looking over your shoulder, always in danger." Claire's voice trembled with anger and sadness. "I would have rather faced it with you than live without you." Lucas's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that words couldn't convey. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you, but I only made things worse." Claire's heart ached at his words, but there was no time for tears. "What now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Lucas paused, his expression pained but resolute. "Now, we fight back," he said. "We stop running and we take control." Claire was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. She felt a spark of determination igniting within her, a sense of purpose that had been lost for so long. "Then we fight together," she declared. As the island drew nearer, they began to strategize. Lucas explained the situation in more detail, finally giving Claire a clearer picture of the enemies they faced. "They're part of a larger network," he said, his voice grim. "Powerful, connected. I tried to expose them from the inside, but it only made me a target." Claire listened intently, her mind processing the information. "And they want you dead because you know too much," she summarized. Lucas nodded. "Exactly. But now they know you're involved too. It won't be long before they come for you." Claire's expression hardened. "Then we need to hit them before they hit us." Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I always knew you were stronger than you realized." The lifeboat finally reached the shore, scraping against the rocky beach. Claire and Lucas jumped out, pulling it onto the sand to conceal it behind a cluster of rocks. The island was dark and eerily quiet, but it offered the refuge they needed. As they sat on the beach, catching their breath, Claire looked out at the ocean, her mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. "We can't hide forever," she said quietly. "We need allies, someone who can help us." Lucas seemed lost in thought for a moment. "I have contacts," he said slowly. "People I can trust, but it's risky. We'd have to move fast, and we'd need resources." Claire nodded, her mind already working. "I still have some connections too," she said. "People from my journalism days, ones who specialize in exposing corruption. We can use that to our advantage." Lucas's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and urgency. "Then we have a chance," he said. "But we have to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart." Claire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. "We don't have the luxury of fear anymore," she said firmly. "We've come too far to back down now." The night stretched on, but neither of them felt tired. They stayed awake, discussing plans, sharing memories, and finally, opening up about the pain of the past few years. Claire learned more about the sacrifices Lucas had made, the lies he had told to protect her, and the relentless guilt that had haunted him. And Lucas, in turn, heard about the hollow years Claire had spent without him, the unanswered questions, and the deep, unresolved love that had never faded. As dawn broke over the horizon, they both knew there was no turning back. They were in this together, and the fight for their freedom, and the truth, had only just begun. The island was small, covered in dense foliage with rugged cliffs that loomed against the early morning sky. It provided an unexpected sense of safety, but Claire knew it was only temporary. Their enemies wouldn't stop searching, and time was running out. Lucas and Claire made their way to a small clearing at the center of the island. They found an abandoned shack, likely left behind by fishermen long ago. It wasn't much, a few broken pieces of furniture, rusted cans, and a dusty floor, but it offered shelter. Lucas inspected the walls and windows, checking for weaknesses, while Claire gathered what little supplies they had left from the lifeboat. First things first, Lucas said, tossing his damp jacket aside. We need to get in touch with someone outside. There's a contact of mine, an ex-CIA operative named Sullivan. He's off the grid but can provide intel and possibly a way off the island. Claire felt a surge of hope. How do we reach him? Lucas dug into his pocket and pulled out a small, water-resistant phone, his last remaining link to the outside world. He dialed a number quickly, then held the phone to his ear, pacing as he waited. "Come on, Sully," he muttered under his breath. Claire watched anxiously. Lucas's face was a mask of concentration, each passing second stretching into what felt like hours. Then, finally, he spoke. "Sullivan, it's me. I need an extraction, urgent. And I have a passenger." The voice on the other end crackled through, distorted but clear enough. Claire couldn't make out the words, but Lucas's responses were quick and precise. "Understood," he said. "We're on an island off Santorini. It's a small one, not marked on most maps. We need coordinates for the rendezvous and a safe exit route." There was a pause, and then Lucas nodded. "Got it. Make it quick. We're exposed here." He hung up, turning to Claire with a grim look. "Sullivan's sending a boat, but it'll take at least 6 hours to get here. We need to stay hidden until then." Claire nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and urgency. "And after that?" Lucas's gaze was steady but cautious. "We regroup. We need to get to a safe house where we can access Sullivan's network. Once we're secure, we'll start planning how to bring down the people hunting us." Claire's mind raced. "And who exactly are they, Lucas? Who are we really up against?" Lucas hesitated, then finally spoke. "It's not just one group. It's a coalition of corrupt businessmen, rogue agents, and international criminals. They operate through a front company called Praxis Corporation. It's been tied to everything from weapons smuggling to human trafficking. I tried to expose them from the inside, but they had deeper roots than I realized." Claire felt a wave of anger mixed with disbelief. "And you didn't think to warn me?" Lucas's voice was filled with regret. "I thought keeping you out of it would protect you. I was wrong." Claire sighed, her frustration mixing with a strange sense of understanding. "What's their endgame?" "Money, power, control," Lucas replied. "But they also need to maintain secrecy. That's why they've been so relentless. They can't afford loose ends, and right now, we're the biggest ones they have." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to find a way to expose them. It's the only way to stop them." Lucas nodded. "Exactly. But that won't be easy. They have allies everywhere. People in high places will try to shut us down before we can even start." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Claire knew the odds were against them, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that burned brighter than her fear. She turned to Lucas, her eyes resolute. "Whatever it takes," she said firmly. "I'm with you." Lucas's gaze softened, a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I never deserved you, Claire," he said quietly. Claire felt a lump in her throat, but she forced a small smile. "You did what you thought was right. Now, let's do it together." The hours passed slowly, each one filled with an uneasy sense of anticipation. They stayed low, keeping watch for any signs of approaching boats or helicopters. Claire's instincts as a journalist came alive, her senses sharp and alert. She couldn't help but mentally map out the angles of attack, possible hiding spots, and ways to escape if needed. Suddenly, the distant sound of a motor broke through the silence. Claire's heart leapt as she and Lucas rushed to the edge of the cliff. A speedboat was approaching, fast, but not stealthily. It wasn't Sullivan's extraction. "It's them," Lucas said, his voice low but urgent. "They found us." Claire felt a surge of panic. "What do we do?" "We need to hold them off until Sullivan arrives," Lucas replied. "There's no way we can outrun them now." They sprinted back to the shack, gathering whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Metal rods, broken planks, and the few supplies they had left. Lucas handed Claire a small knife, his eyes serious. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "And if things go bad, just run." Claire shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." Lucas didn't argue. There was no time. The men were closing in, moving quickly through the dense foliage, their footsteps growing louder. Claire's grip tightened on the knife, her heart pounding in her chest. The first attacker emerged from the trees, a burly man with a gun drawn. Lucas moved fast, lunging forward and disarming him in a brutal, efficient motion. Claire felt a surge of adrenaline as she swung her metal rod at another attacker, catching him off guard. It was chaos, a blur of fists, kicks, and desperate maneuvers. Claire and Lucas fought with everything they had, driven by a primal will to survive. But they were outnumbered, and it became clear that they couldn't hold out for long. Just when Claire felt her strength faltering, the sound of another boat engine filled the air. It was louder, more powerful, and it was coming from the opposite side of the island. Claire's heart soared with hope. "Sullivan!" Lucas shouted, recognizing the sound. The attackers seemed to realize this too. There was a moment of hesitation, and then they retreated, disappearing into the trees. Claire collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. Lucas knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. "Are you hurt?" Claire shook her head, catching her breath. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "But we need to go now." They made their way to the opposite shore, where Sullivan's boat was waiting. A tall, rugged man stood at the helm, his eyes sharp and focused. "Get in, both of you," he shouted. Claire and Lucas scrambled aboard, collapsing onto the deck as Sullivan gunned the engine, speeding away from the island. The danger wasn't over, but they had managed to escape, at least for now. As the island faded into the distance, Claire looked at Lucas, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and determination. "We made it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas's hand found hers, his grip strong and steady. "For now," he agreed. "But the real fight is just beginning." Claire nodded, her gaze turning towards the horizon. The open sea stretched before them, filled with both danger and possibility. But she was no longer running alone, and that made all the difference. The boat cut through the waves, leaving the dark silhouette of the island behind. The wind whipped against Claire's face, a cold reminder of the risks they still faced. As the adrenaline began to wear off, she felt the exhaustion in her bones, each muscle aching from the fight. But she couldn't let herself relax. There was too much at stake. Lucas and Claire sat side by side on the deck, both silent as Sullivan steered the boat toward the mainland. The morning sun began to rise, casting a faint glow over the water. It was surreal, the calmness of the sea contrasting sharply with the chaos they had just escaped. Sullivan finally broke the silence. "You two made quite the mess back there," he said gruffly, glancing over his shoulder. "I hope it was worth it." Lucas nodded, his face hardened by the ordeal. "We got what we needed," he said. "Now we need to move fast." Claire turned to Lucas, her eyes still filled with questions. "What's the next step? How do we actually stop them?" Lucas looked at her, his expression a mix of determination and weariness. "First, we need to regroup and gather allies," he explained. "We can't take on Praxis Corp alone, but I know people who can help, people who've been fighting these kinds of battles for years." Claire thought about the danger they were still in, the powerful enemies they were up against. "But how do we trust anyone?" she asked. "What if they're compromised too?" Lucas's eyes were steady. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We need their resources and their connections. It's a risk, but it's one we have to take." Sullivan chimed in, his voice low and cautious. "I've set up a temporary safe house in Athens," he said. "It's secure, off the grid. We can lay low there, make contact with Lucas's people, and figure out our next move." Claire nodded, grateful for Sullivan's presence. Despite his gruff demeanor, he seemed capable and trustworthy. "Thank you," she said simply. Sullivan shrugged. "Just doing my job," he replied. "But don't expect it to be easy from here. They'll be expecting you to make contact, and they'll be watching." Lucas glanced at Claire, a silent understanding passing between them. "We know," he said. The boat reached the shore just before noon, docking at a small, secluded marina. It was a quiet area, away from prying eyes and the bustle of the city. Claire and Lucas climbed out, feeling the solid ground beneath their feet again. It was a small victory, but one that carried a sense of urgency. Sullivan led them to an inconspicuous car parked nearby. "Get in," he said. "We need to be quick." The drive to Athens was tense, with Lucas and Sullivan constantly checking the rearview mirrors for any signs of a tail. Claire's mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened and everything that still needed to be done. The car moved through winding back roads, avoiding main highways to reduce the risk of detection. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Sullivan parked the car and led them inside, down a narrow staircase into a basement level that had been converted into a makeshift command center. The room was dimly lit, filled with computers, maps, and communication devices. "This is it," Sullivan said. "Not much, but it's safe." Lucas immediately moved to one of the computers, typing rapidly as he accessed a secure network. Claire watched him, feeling both admiration and frustration. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. Lucas didn't look up. "Since before I met you," he admitted. "I was already undercover when we got involved. Everything I told you about my work was true, but I kept the darker parts hidden." Claire felt a surge of anger, a reminder of the betrayal she had experienced. "So it was all a lie," she said, her voice filled with hurt. Lucas stopped typing and looked at her, his eyes raw with emotion. "No," he said firmly. "The feelings were real. Everything I did was to protect you, even if it meant lying." Claire's anger was mixed with a deeper, more painful understanding. She had spent so long hating him for leaving, but now she was starting to see the sacrifices he had made. "And now?" she asked. "What happens now?" Lucas's gaze was intense. "Now, we finish what I started," he said. "We expose Praxis Corp for what it is and bring down everyone involved. But we have to be smart. We'll need leverage, evidence that they can't bury or destroy." Claire felt a flicker of hope. "I still have my contacts from my journalism days," she offered. "People who can help us get the story out, if we can gather the proof." Lucas nodded. "That's exactly what we need," he said. "But it won't be easy. Praxis has spent years building a network of cover-ups, false leads, and dead ends. We'll have to be relentless." The following days were a whirlwind of planning, strategizing, and reaching out to potential allies. Claire used her connections to track down investigative journalists, activists, and hackers who had been fighting similar battles. Some were skeptical, others were intrigued, but all of them were wary. "Are you sure this isn't a setup?" one journalist asked Claire during a covert phone call. "No," Claire admitted, "but I know what's at stake, and I know we need to expose the truth, no matter what." Lucas, meanwhile, worked with Sullivan to analyze Praxis's operations, tracking financial transactions, tracing communication logs, and identifying key players within the organization. It was a massive task, and every new piece of information felt like a small victory in a much larger war. But as they dug deeper, the danger became more apparent. There were attempted breaches of their communications, sudden disappearances of potential allies, and veiled threats delivered through anonymous messages. One night, as Claire sat alone in the basement, reviewing files on her laptop, Lucas approached her quietly. "You should get some rest," he said softly. "You haven't slept in 2 days." Claire looked up, her eyes tired but determined. "Neither have you." Lucas gave a half-smile, his face etched with fatigue. "Fair point," he said. He paused, then added, "I know I've asked too much of you already, but I need you to know. I'm grateful you stayed." Claire felt a lump in her throat, but she managed a small smile. "I didn't have much of a choice," she said, her voice softer than before. "You left me once. I couldn't let it happen again." Lucas's expression was filled with both pain and gratitude. "I won't leave you again," he promised. Before either of them could say more, Sullivan burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem," he announced. "Praxis just made a move. They've deployed a hit squad. They know where we are." Claire felt a surge of fear, but Lucas's reaction was swift. "We need to move now," he ordered. They gathered their things quickly, abandoning the basement in minutes. As they drove away from the safe house, Claire felt a strange sense of clarity. They were deep in enemy territory, but they were still fighting, still moving forward. "Where to now?" Claire asked, her voice steady. Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "We go on the offensive," he said. We take the fight to them. Claire nodded, a fierce determination burning within her. She knew the risks, knew how dangerous the path ahead was. But she also knew one thing for certain. They were no longer running. They were fighting back, and they wouldn't stop until the truth was finally revealed. The car raced through the dark streets of Athens, headlights cutting through the thick fog of uncertainty. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging with every turn. Lucas was beside her, scanning their surroundings with a sharp, focused gaze. Sullivan drove fast but skillfully, keeping to side roads and alleyways to avoid any detection. "We have one last shot," Lucas said, breaking the tense silence. "We're going straight to the top. There's a high-level meeting of Praxis's executives happening tonight at a mansion just outside the city." Claire felt a surge of determination mixed with fear. "What's our plan?" Lucas turned to her, his expression serious. "We're going to get the evidence we need. Records, files, confessions. Everything that proves their corruption and crimes. Once we have it, we'll go public. It's our only chance to stop them for good." Claire's eyes burned with a relentless fire. "Let's end this," she said. They reached the outskirts of Athens, where the mansion loomed like a dark fortress. High walls and security cameras surrounded it, but Lucas seemed unfazed. "There's a hidden entrance," he explained. "It's not on the plans, but I discovered it during my time undercover." Sullivan parked the car in a secluded area nearby, handing them each a small earpiece. "I'll stay in contact from here," he said. "If anything goes wrong, you need to pull out immediately." Lucas nodded, then turned to Claire. "Ready?" She took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They moved silently through the shadows, using the cover of darkness to approach the back of the mansion. Just as Lucas had said, there was a small, concealed gate partially obscured by ivy. He picked the lock quickly, and they slipped inside, entering a narrow passage that led to the mansion's lower level. The interior was opulent, filled with priceless artwork and lavish decor. It was a stark reminder of the wealth and power they were up against. But Claire felt no intimidation, only a fierce determination to uncover the truth. Lucas led the way, his movements confident and precise. They navigated the mansion's hallways, avoiding guards and slipping into rooms undetected. Finally, they reached a secure room that Lucas identified as the control center. "This is where they keep the servers," he whispered. "All the data we need is here." Claire watched as Lucas hacked into the system, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. Files began to appear on the screen. Documents, emails, transaction records, all of them linking Praxis Corp to its vast network of illegal activities. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice filled with urgency. "We have everything we need." Claire quickly copied the files onto a flash drive, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Now we just have to get out of here and get this to the press," she said. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Claire's eyes widened as she realized they had been discovered. Lucas reacted instantly, pulling her into a nearby closet, his hand covering her mouth to silence her breathing. They held their breath as the guards passed by, their radios crackling with orders to search the area. Once the coast was clear, Lucas whispered urgently, "We have to move faster. The longer we stay, the more likely we are to get trapped." They continued their escape, moving swiftly but cautiously. Just as they reached the exit, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows, a tall man with a cold, calculating gaze. Claire recognized him from the files, Elias Markov, the head of Praxis Corp. "Well, well," Markov said with a sinister smile. "I knew you couldn't stay away, Lucas. And you brought company. How charming." Lucas's eyes blazed with fury. "It's over, Markov. We have the evidence, and soon the whole world will know what you've done." Markov laughed, a chilling sound. "You think you can bring us down with a few files? We own the media, the politicians, the courts. There's nowhere you can run." Claire stepped forward, her voice filled with defiance. "We're not running anymore. We're fighting." Markov's smile faded, replaced by a cold sneer. "Then you're both going to die here." In a flash, Lucas lunged at Markov, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled fiercely, each trying to gain the upper hand. Claire watched, her mind racing. She spotted a gun holstered at Markov's side and grabbed it, aiming it with shaking hands. "Stop!" she shouted. Both men froze, Markov's eyes narrowing as he looked up at Claire. "You won't shoot," he taunted. "You don't have it in you." Claire's hand trembled, but her voice was steady. "Try me." Lucas took advantage of the moment, disarming Markov and knocking him unconscious with a single punch. He turned to Claire, his eyes filled with urgency. "We have to go now." They made their way back through the mansion, adrenaline surging as they reached the same hidden gate they had entered through. Sullivan's voice crackled through the earpiece. "I've got a car waiting. You have less than 3 minutes before the backup arrives." Claire and Lucas sprinted towards the exit, their hearts pounding with every step. They reached the waiting car and jumped in, Sullivan flooring the accelerator as they sped away from the mansion. "We got it all," Claire said breathlessly, holding up the flash drive. "Now we just have to get it out there." Sullivan nodded. "I have contacts at a secure news outlet. They'll get this to the right people." Lucas turned to Claire, his eyes filled with both relief and lingering tension. "It's not over yet," he said. "Once this goes public, there'll be fallout. People trying to cover their tracks, others seeking revenge." Claire met his gaze, a steely resolve in her eyes. "Let them come," she said. "We're ready." The following hours were a blur of strategic phone calls, encrypted emails, and covert meetings. The flash drive made its way into the hands of trusted journalists, who immediately began breaking the story. News outlets across the globe picked up the information, detailing the full extent of Praxis Corp's operations, fraud, trafficking, murder. The response was swift and overwhelming. There were arrests, resignations, and international investigations launched. Praxis Corp, once untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Claire and Lucas watched the news reports from a safe house, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. "We did it," Claire said softly, a sense of disbelief washing over her. Lucas reached out, taking her hand. "You did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief this time. "I never stopped believing in you," she admitted. Lucas pulled her close, his voice filled with a raw honesty that had been missing for so long. "And I never stopped loving you," he said. The weight of the past years seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of closure and a new beginning. They had faced the darkness together and come out the other side, scarred but not broken. As the sun rose over Athens, Claire and Lucas stood side by side, looking out at a city that was waking up to a new reality, one where the truth had finally prevailed. "Where do we go from here?" Claire asked, a hint of hope in her voice. Lucas smiled, a real, unburdened smile. "Anywhere," he said, "as long as it's together." And with that, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next.